In the high-stakes, smoke-filled conference rooms of London and Washington during the dark, uncertain spring of 1942, a fundamental intellectual civil war raged over the grand strategy of the Western Allies. To understand this deep division, one must look past the superficial post-war narrative of harmonious Anglo-American cooperation and examine the cold, unyielding doctrines of the respective military establishments. On one side of the Atlantic stood the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by the towering figure of General George C. Marshall, a strategist of uncompromising orthodox clarity. Marshall and his primary operations planner, Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower, operated under a distinct military philosophy that a war of attrition on the periphery of Europe was a dangerous, wasteful dispersion of force that would only bleed the Allies white and prolong the conflict. To the American War Department, the only orthodox path to victory lay in the rapid, overwhelming concentration of mass and kinetic energy directly against the German center of gravity in Western Europe, utilizing the shortest and most direct geographic corridor, the English Channel. Marshall believed that a direct frontal assault on the coast of occupied France, followed by a rapid advance into the Ruhr industrial basin, was the most efficient and mathematically sound way to crush the Nazi regime. This American strategic drive was driven to a fever pitch by the terrifying operational situation on the Eastern Front. In early 1942, the Soviet Union was facing the full, concentrated weight of the German military machine during the opening phases of Case Blue, as the Red Army reeled backward across the barren steppes of the Don Bend and the vital oil fields of the Caucasus were threatened. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin unleashed a relentless, desperate diplomatic offensive. Stalin repeatedly warned his Western allies that if they did not open a second front in Europe in 1942 to draw off at least 40 German divisions from the east, the Soviet Union might collapse or be forced to seek a separate peace with Adolf Hitler. This political nightmare played directly on the anxieties of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, eager to demonstrate American commitment to the global coalition, rashly issued a joint communique in May 1942, stating that complete agreement had been reached regarding the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. This public promise went far beyond what Marshall's planners could logistically support, creating an acute diplomatic crisis. In response, Marshall's staff formulated Operation Sledgehammer, an emergency cross-channel landing of 5 to 6 Allied divisions scheduled for the autumn of 1942, to be launched as a desperate, self-sacrificial attempt to relieve Soviet pressure or to seize a beachhead if German power in the West suddenly collapsed. However, when Marshall presented this plan to the British military leadership, he ran directly into a wall of polite but unyielding skepticism. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, viewed the American proposal with profound alarm. The British military establishment was governed by a very different historical memory, one shaped by the catastrophic, bleeding trauma of the Somme, Passchendaele, and the humiliating narrow escape of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk in 1940. Brooke and Churchill knew that the Wehrmacht of 1942 remained a highly experienced, tactically flexible, and lethal opponent at the absolute peak of its operational efficiency. To land a small, under-resourced Allied force on the heavily defended beaches of occupied France without adequate landing craft, heavy artillery, or continuous air support would not be a strategic rescue. It would be a rapid, bloody slaughter. Brooke recognized that a failed invasion in 1942 would destroy the core of the Western Allies' trained infantry and armored reserves, hand Hitler a monumental strategic and propaganda victory, and delay any realistic hope of liberating Europe by several years. Consequently, the British fought a persistent, highly sophisticated diplomatic campaign to kill Operation Sledgehammer, championing instead a peripheral maritime strategy that would utilize Anglo-American naval superiority to clear the Mediterranean and constrict the Axis periphery, a strategic vision that ultimately triumphed with the decision to launch Operation Torch in French North Africa. While the grand strategists debated in high-level summits, the ultimate feasibility of Operation Sledgehammer was governed not by grand political desires, but by the cold, unyielding and mathematically precise laws of amphibious logistics. The single most decisive, insurmountable bottleneck that rendered any major cross-channel landing in 1942 an operational fantasy was the acute, catastrophic shortage of specialized amphibious landing craft, particularly landing ships, tank LSTs, and landing craft, tank LCTs. To execute a successful amphibious assault against a defended coastline, an invading army must be able to land not just infantry, but thousands of tons of heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and fuel in the very first waves to match the defensive fire and counter-offensive power of the enemy. In the spring and summer of 1942, the specialized vessels required to perform this monumental task simply did not exist. The Allied industrial base had barely begun the complex process of designing, testing, and mass-producing specialized landing ships. The total inventory of ocean-going landing ships in the British Isles was measured in dozens, rather than the hundreds or thousands that would eventually make the Normandy landings of 1944 possible. British shipyards, already overtaxed by the critical demands of repairing merchant shipping and building anti-submarine escorts for the Battle of the Atlantic, had very limited capacity to produce these complex vessels, while the American landing craft program was still in its infancy, plagued by design modifications and shortages of high-strength steel plate. This critical deficit was further worsened by the devastating shipping losses inflicted by German U-boats during the height of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. Under the relentless command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the German submarine fleet executed a highly coordinated, devastating offensive against Allied merchant shipping along the east coast of the United States and the transatlantic convoy routes. This offensive, known as the Second Happy Time, resulted in the sinking of over 3 million tons of Allied merchant shipping in the first half of 1942 alone. These staggering losses created an acute global shipping crisis that severely restricted the Allied ability to transport troops, heavy weapons, and basic supplies across the Atlantic to the British Isles. The buildup of American forces in Great Britain, codenamed Operation Bolero, fell months behind schedule, meaning that by the summer of 1942, there was only a single American division, the 1st Infantry Division, fully trained, equipped, and positioned in the United Kingdom. To attempt a major invasion under these conditions would have required sending raw, half-trained troops into battle with critically low stockpiles of ammunition and fuel, with no guarantee that a continuous high-volume sea lane of resupply could be maintained across the Channel in the face of active German submarine E-boat and air interdiction. Furthermore, the physical and spatial constraints of the French coastline added another layer of logistical impossibility to any 1942 landing. Because Allied fighter aircraft of the period had an extremely limited operational range, any landing under Operation Sledgehammer had to take place in either the Pas-de-Calais region or the Cotentin Peninsula. The Pas-de-Calais, while offering the shortest sea crossing, possessed some of the most difficult tidal ranges and strongest coastal currents in Western Europe, with massive chalk cliffs overlooking the few narrow beach exits. To land on these beaches without specialized landing craft meant that Allied troops would be trapped on the narrow shingle beaches, unable to bring heavy armor or artillery ashore to support the infantry, while being subjected to direct pre-sighted fire from dominating clifftop positions. The lack of specialized artificial harbors, the mulberries, or pipelines under the ocean, Pluto, which were only developed after years of painful experimentation, meant that the Allies would be entirely dependent on the immediate rapid capture of a major, intact deep water port, such as Cherbourg or Havre, to unload the thousands of tons of daily supplies required to sustain the lodgment. However, German defense plans placed supreme emphasis on the absolute denial of ports, ensuring that any port threatened with capture would be thoroughly demolished and blocked with sunken block ships. Without a functioning port or specialized landing craft, any force landed on the French coast in 1942 would have been rapidly starved of supplies and ammunition, leaving them completely vulnerable to a swift, decisive German counterstroke. Even if we were to magically wave a logistical wand and grant the Allies the thousands of landing craft they lacked, any invasion attempt in 1942 would have faced an operational tactical balance of power in occupied France that was heavily weighted in favor of the German defenders. In 1942, the German military presence in Western Europe, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West, was a highly formidable, experienced and strategically mobile force, far different from the depleted, static and low-quality divisions that the Allies encountered in Normandy in June of 1944. Under Rundstedt's command, OB West disposed of approximately 30 divisions, which were organized into the 15th Army, defending the Pas-de-Calais, and the 7th Army defending Normandy and Brittany. While many of these divisions were undergoing refitting or training after serving on the Eastern Front, they possessed a high core of experienced officers, non-commissioned officers, and combat veterans. Crucially, the German forces in the West in 1942 retained a highly powerful and intact operational reserve of mobile, mechanized formations. Rundstedt had immediate access to several elite panzer and motorized divisions, including the 1st Panzer Division, the 6th Panzer Division, and the SS Division Das Reich, which were fully equipped with modern Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and held in central strategic locations from which they could rapidly strike any Allied beachhead. Because the Atlantic Wall was still in its early stages of construction, German defensive doctrine in 1942 relied not on static concrete bunkers, but on highly flexible, aggressive mobile defense. The German plan was to allow the enemy to land, contain them on the beaches with localized infantry forces, and then rapidly concentrate their elite panzer reserves to launch a decisive, overwhelming counterattack to drive the invaders back into the sea before they could consolidate their positions or land heavy weapons. Given the Allied inability to land tanks or heavy artillery in the opening waves of Sledgehammer due to the landing craft crisis, these highly experienced panzer divisions would have easily overrun the isolated, lightly armed Allied infantry perimeters within 48 to 72 hours. This ground-level vulnerability was doubled by the critical limitations of Allied air power in 1942. A fundamental prerequisite for any successful amphibious landing is the establishment of absolute air superiority over the landing beaches and the immediate hinterland to protect the vulnerable assault ships from air attack and to prevent the enemy from moving their mobile reserves. In 1942, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command was completely incapable of providing this continuous, high-density air umbrella over the French coast. The primary Allied fighter aircraft of the period, the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, was a magnificent defensive fighter, but possessed an extremely limited operational range of only about 200 miles. When operating from air bases in southern England, the Spitfire could spend no more than 15 to 20 minutes over the beaches of the Pas-de-Calais or the Cotentin Peninsula before being forced to return to base to refuel. This meant that the RAF would have to maintain a massive rotating shuttle of fighter squadrons to keep a continuous presence over the beaches, a task that would have exhausted their pilot reserves and left many sectors temporarily uncovered. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe's air defense forces in the West, organized under Luftflotte 3, were at the absolute peak of their strength and tactical efficiency. Luftflotte 3 was equipped with the deadly Focke-Wulf FW-190, a fighter that was technologically superior to the Spitfire Mark V in speed, roll rate, and firepower. The German fighter squadrons in France were operating from fully prepared concrete runway airfields situated directly adjacent to the coast, giving them a massive operational advantage in response time, fuel endurance, and localized concentration of force. Any attempt to maintain a continuous Allied air umbrella over France in 1942 would have resulted in a massive attritional air battle in which the RAF would have suffered catastrophic losses, leaving the invasion fleet completely exposed to the devastating attacks of German Junkers Ju-88 and Dornier Do-217 bombers. The tragic, bloody validity of these logistical and operational warnings was demonstrated with absolute clarity on August 19, 1942, during Operation Jubilee, the disastrous raid on the French port of Dieppe. Operation Jubilee was conceived as a large-scale, one-day reconnaissance in force designed to test the feasibility of capturing a port, gather intelligence, and appease Soviet demands for a second front. The force, consisting of over 6,000 troops, primarily from the elite 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, accompanied by a regiment of Churchill tanks and supported by RAF fighter squadrons, was landed directly against the heavily defended port town of Dieppe. The result was a swift, unmitigated slaughter. The Canadian infantry was pinned down on the pebble beaches within minutes of landing, subjected to devastating pre-sighted crossfire from German machine guns, mortars, and heavy artillery situated in concrete cliffs overlooking the harbour. The Churchill tanks, landed from primitive landing craft, mechanized, were unable to gain traction on the loose Chingle beach or were blocked by concrete road obstacles, leaving them to be systematically destroyed by German anti-tank guns. The RAF, attempting to provide air support, was drawn into a massive air battle over the town and suffered its single most costly day of the entire war, losing over 100 aircraft compared to only 48 lost by Luftflotte 3. Of the 5,000 Canadian troops who landed, over 3,300 were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours, with the survivors forced into a chaotic, desperate evacuation. The Dieppe raid proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that even a limited, highly trained assault force could not capture a defended port without massive naval gunfire support, specialized armored engineering vehicles, and absolute air supremacy. To scale this disaster up to the 5-division, open-ended invasion envisioned under Operation Sledgehammer would have been to condemn the entire Anglo-American expeditionary force to absolute systematic annihilation. Far from being a viable path to victory, Operation Sledgehammer was an operational fantasy that would have played directly into the hands of the Wehrmacht. It would have effectively destroyed the core of the Western Allied military capability and postponed any realistic hope of defeating Nazi Germany for a generation. It was the strategic wisdom of Winston Churchill and Sir Alan Brooke that resisted this political pressure and saved the Allies from a catastrophic self-destruction, ensuring that when they finally returned to the beaches of France on June 6, 1944, they did so with the overwhelming mass, specialized equipment, absolute air supremacy, and logistical supremacy required to stay and win.